Engineering conversation and innovation. This is Schulich Connects, proudly sponsored by TD Insurance.
It's lovely to see you here. We are delighted to host you this morning for our Schulich Connects event entitled Neurodiversity and Inclusion, the Role of Technology. And this event is proudly sponsored by TD Insurance. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7 here in southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Goodstoney First Nations. And the City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. Approximately 1 in 6 individuals in Canada are neurodivergent. And neurodivergent individuals possess a diverse array of strengths that bring unique perspectives, crucial for solving a variety of complex real-world problems. Yet, they often face systemic barriers that prevent them from being included effectively in educational and workplace settings. Our panel today will discuss how innovative technology solutions can be used to create inclusive environments that allow neurodivergent individuals to thrive and reach their full potential in academic and employment settings. Before I pass it over to our speakers this morning, just a few logistics. So there will be an opportunity to ask questions later on in the program. So for our in-person guests, please hold your questions, and when we get to that point, somebody will be coming around with a microphone, and you can just indicate if you want to ask a question. And for our virtual guests that are joining us online this morning, please email your questions to ssemc@ucalgary.ca, and they will be shared with the panel. And don't worry, we'll get that email address up on the slides here in a minute so that you can copy that down. Finally, I have a special request for this morning. To respect the neurodiversity of our guests today, I ask that you please hold your applause this morning. So I'd now like to take a moment to introduce to you our moderator for today, Dr. Diwakar Krishnamurthy. Diwakar is a professor in the Department of Electrical and Software Engineering here at the Schulich School of Engineering. And his current research focuses on the application of technologies such as augmented reality, virtual reality, and artificial intelligence to improve communication, education, and inclusion for individuals within the autism spectrum, individuals who cannot communicate reliably through speech. Diwakar is leading an international transdisciplinary collaboration to build the next generation of assistive technology for this population. His research has contributed several innovative communication and educational apps for this population. Diwakar's research team has attracted competitive funding over the past 4 years, resulting in high-impact publications, leading to knowledge translation with several non-speaker therapy practices in Canada and the US, trialing the research group's prototypes. So I'd now like to pass things over to Diwakar, who will introduce us to today's panel. Diwakar, over to you.
Thank you, Anders, for the kind introduction. It's great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for braving the snow and the elements and making it here. So this topic is a passion for me, the intersection of neurodiversity, technology, and inclusion. As Anders mentioned, I've been, for the past 4 years, privileged to work with the autistic community, co-designing assistive technology, communication technology apps, which can improve communication outcomes, education outcomes, and inclusion. So this panel is really, really timely, and I'm looking forward to a stimulating discussion with our esteemed panel. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. So if I can ask the panelists to introduce themselves one by one, I'll start with Lloyd. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Lloyd Summers. I'm the technical co-founder at Red Iron Labs, and I oversee all of the design and development. And so for us, it's been a huge opportunity trying to figure out how do we bring on and engage people who are neurodiverse in a technology company that's constantly changing. And so a little bit about my history. I've worked on over 250 mobile apps and games, another 150 augmented and virtual reality experiences. And we've been building empathy-driven multiplayer experiences for about 8 years now. And we do a ton of work with different groups, including U of C, And right now we're pushing really hard in expanding our knowledge in neurodiversity, stroke recovery, and dementia care especially. So,
Thank you, Lloyd. Carly?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carly McMorris, she, her. I am an associate professor at the Workland School of Education in the School in Applied Child Psychology program, and a clinical psychologist by training. My work has really been focusing on how do we improve the well-being and mental health of autistic and neurodivergent youth and young adults. I've been working in this space for about 20 years, specifically about how we can promote and prevent mental health issues from happening, and by including things like peer mentorship program in higher education is one way that we've been able to do that effectively. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Carly. Jennifer?
Okay. My name is Jennifer Williamson, they, them, and I'm a second-year master's student in experimental psychology who is supervised by Carly here. And my research focuses on understanding the mental health experiences of autistic students attending U Calgary. And this area is just such a passion of mine because I am on the autism spectrum myself. And it's kind of my mission as a researcher to better understand and improve the quality of life of autistic folks and just basically give back to this community and help people who might have come from less privileged backgrounds than mine. Because I had a lot of support growing up, both from my parents and from things such as the Renfrew system here in Calgary, and yeah, just want to contribute to better quality of life for neurodiverse folks.
Wonderful. So we'll start with the discussion. My first question is for Carly. I'm going to put on my professorial hat and ask you to define what neurodiversity means, and that's only the first part of my question. And second part of my question is, can you explain the language around neurodiversity, especially people first and identity first language?
Great, thanks so much. So neurodiversity describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world in a variety of different ways. There is no single right way to learn, to think, or to behave in our environment. And that there's these differences that exist, and that doesn't necessarily equate to deficits or difficulties, but rather are strengths, and that we should be fostering those in neurodivergent folks. So in terms of the person first versus identity first language, this is a huge, I would say, hot topic in the field of neurodiversity currently. So there's sort of several different ways of describing autism, all with their own rationale. So person first language, or what we would say person with autism, has historically been used to really put the person before the disability, while identity first language, or autistic person, conveys that autism is an important and permanent part of one's identity. So while there's lots of different ways and not one single way or universally accepted way to talk about autism, there's lots and lots of mounting evidence to suggest that we really need to be using that identity first language when referring to autistic people. And using that, or that preference, I guess, is really to sort of highlight that autism cannot be separated from the person and is an aspect of an individual's identity that most people take pride in.
Fantastic, thank you. Jennifer, the next question is for you. What does it mean to identify as a neurodivergent individual? That's the first part of the question. Second part, are there systemic barriers and challenges that impact how neurodivergent students navigate post-secondary education?
Well, I guess, what does it mean to be a neurodivergent individual? Well, first off, everyone who's neurodivergent is probably going to give you a different answer to that because neurodiversity can be such a personal thing. And as Carly said, there's a lot of different perspectives on and ways of being that. For example, while a lot of people on the autism spectrum might prefer that identity first, autistic person language, not all do, and we should respect people's different preferences for that. But for me, as someone on the autism spectrum, my view on being a neurodivergent individual kind of aligns with Carly, where it's just that my brain just happens to be wired in a different way from most folks. And sometimes that's a strength to me, and sometimes that results in challenges. But overall, it's just a different way of being. Like, it's just a part of me, like how I have brown hair or need glasses or such. And as to whether neurodiverse people experience barriers in society and within higher education in particular, honestly, there's mounting evidence that the answer is yes, they do. And kind of the reason for that is just that society is not designed for neurodiverse people. And it's not necessarily out of malice or ableism, but just because that most people are neurotypical, i.e. not neurodivergent, and they just don't have neurodiverse people in mind when designing spaces. It's kind of similar to how, for example, in public spaces, there might be stairs instead of ramps. And that's because there might have been an able-bodied person designing these spaces, and they didn't realize that, oh, maybe I should design places with ramp in case someone needs to use a wheelchair and thus can't use stairs. So in a similar way, a lot of spaces just end up inaccessible or challenging to neurodiverse folks. And one of the key challenges is with sensory barriers. So our senses include things like sight, smell, hearing, and honestly, those senses can be really overwhelming for a lot of neurodiverse folks and even some neurotypical folks. That, for example, some spaces are just too loud. Some spaces, especially ones with food, might have a whole bunch of weird smells that make it hard to concentrate. And a lot of people can be bothered by things like fluorescent lighting. So it's just a lot of these different barriers in the environment, not within the individual, that can make things challenging for them. And I do just want to emphasize that neurodiverse people have a lot of strengths and can bring a lot to the table. And for example, they often have a lot of strong academic potential, but because of these environmental barriers, they often underperform and are unable to bring up their full strengths. So therefore, it's important to design our environments to be more accommodating so that everyone can succeed and be their full potential. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer. And actually, the next question is a follow-up to Carly about designing spaces in a more thoughtful way. Again, it's a two-parter. My apologies. The first part is, do neurodivergent people, are they at a higher risk of adverse mental health outcomes? So number two, what kind of structures and strategies and supports can we put in place at places like universities to help them thrive?
Great question. So as I mentioned, my work is really around understanding mental health experiences of autistic and neurodivergent folks. So what we know is that autistic people and those who are neurodivergent are at a substantially higher risk for experiencing mental health issues than the general population. So for example, we know that about 70% of autistic people will experience at least one mental health condition in their lifetime, at least one. Sometimes they experience multiple mental health challenges at the same time. And as Jennifer mentioned, we know that they experience a lot of systemic barriers in accessing supports for those mental health issues. So for example, we know that a lot of our healthcare providers don't actually feel comfortable identifying mental health in autistic people, but also don't really feel comfortable or confident in addressing or supporting those needs. And so these mental health issues become often unrecognized, undiagnosed, and then unsupported, which can have detrimental impacts for autistic people and their families.
Thank you, Carly. Now, Lloyd, I want to bring a technology perspective to this. I know that in your company, you've used in the past technologies like VR and AR to help several at-risk populations. So in your view, how can technology, some of these newer technology like VR, AR, AI, whatever, how can they be used to bring down some of these barriers which Carly and Jennifer spoke about and really let neurodivergent folks thrive?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And I'm up here with brilliant minds, so I got to blend in a little bit. But it's really fascinating. Like, technology is a beautiful thing. When we think about something like virtual reality, it's changing how you interact completely. Where that becomes a huge opportunity is if you think different, if your brain structure is different, having tools that work different become an open-ended book. And so what a neurodivergent person might create as an interesting application that makes them happy or whatever is going to be vastly different from what somebody else does. And what I love about these spaces is they're so creatively open that we're I always say we're limited by our creativity, not by the technology for once. And so if somebody wants to have a different way of engaging a classroom, they can find a way to build it, or it could get built or structured. And so it's just fascinating because with technology constantly evolving, we're able to manipulate that a little bit to do things. And so I think virtual reality, for example, is really good for hands-on. It's really hard to explain to somebody over a phone call how to change the oil on your car. In virtual reality, you could hoist up the car, unplug the thing, and let the oil drain out, and they learn it really, really quickly. And so it translates really well to certain things. And I think for me personally, meeting all kinds of people who don't fit that neurotypical place, it's like a little bombshell that goes off of information. And I know for us, virtual reality is so creative, but it's also all over the place. And so like somebody who is like me, I got a little bit of ADHD and OCD, and I do very well in my job because of that, because I'm constantly doing new things and constantly changing, and then I got to finish a specific scope and do that. Where somebody who needs more long-term work, animation cleanup is a great opportunity where somebody has to be hyper-focused and really detail-oriented for a long period of time. And so there's just a lot of opportunities there, and you don't see those kind of things in traditional software as much.
Yeah, I guess, I think, taking off from the point you made, talking about what Jennifer mentioned about sensory sensitivities, right?
Yeah.
So virtual reality could be really a game changer in kind of defining the sensory environment to be kind of personalized to the needs of a particular neurodivergent student, right? Can you?
Yeah, and it can also be a risk too, because there's no standards of structure. And so you put a virtual reality headset on, we control everything you see, everything you hear, everything you touch. And so if you do get sensory overload, there's no safety measures. Like the developers have to intentionally build those in because there's no standard for it. And I think that goes to the topic of nothing about somebody without them. So never without them, because to assume that it would be a good experience for them without having somebody sit down and put it on and say, no, this is terrible, which has happened before. And then you learn, okay, I'm so sorry I did that, but now we can fix it. Yeah, it's a fascinating field. So.
Fantastic. So on the other side of the coin, we talked about how technology can help neurodivergent folks. But neurodivergent folks have a lot to contribute, and they kind of think about problems in a very unique way, bring a unique perspective. So can you talk about how you, in your company, what are the strategies, and what have you done to harness the talents and make them feel included and contribute and really feel included?
Yeah. Oh man, that's a hard question. So it's really interesting. Like one of the groups we work with right now is at Autism Can Tech. We're doing some work with Norquest and now a little bit with U of C in terms of building empathy-driven scenarios to learn about neurodiversity and what that could look like, bringing it into your workplace. And a couple of really interesting findings to me, because I know very little about this. I can talk about tech all day, but why the mind does what it does was very difficult for me. But it's just really interesting to put a headset on somebody and they go through an experience, see somebody stimming for the first time, and an employer goes, oh my gosh, I need to fix this. And really, it's because they're excited about the work that they did, or trying to understand how to build those safe spaces is really, really important. And I think the topic of mental health came up too, which is there's so much stress on somebody who feels like they don't fit the neurotypical thing to try to fit in. They got all these stresses that are way beyond what we go through, or like what another person would go through. And they got to figure out a job, and they have an employer, and they have the people standing around them, and it's all these extra things over top. And so I think the first-hand response is that it's really hard to try to find out what that safe space looks like. But the impact is the studios or the companies that care then go into a paralysis, and they're terrified to hire somebody because they're like, well, what if I make a mistake? And so they get excluded out of a fear of trying to not be able to help. It's just a really fascinating thing. And so I think the best tool is to educate yourself, and then at some point you got to just cross that line and hope that your research and your advisors and the people around you have given you the tool set to get there. But then to realize that, as long as you have the right goal in mind, I think not being too afraid, because I think stopping somebody from getting a job, not because you want to block them out, but because you feel scared to bring them in, is another way of just like isolating an entire audience of people who could be immensely valuable to your company. So.
Yeah, fantastic point. I think being allowed to make mistakes and learn, I think, is crucial.
Yeah.
So this question is actually free for all. Please, everybody feel free to chime in. As a researcher, I see a lot of papers published about AR, VR, AI, this technology, that, to help neurodivergent population. A lot of commercial products too. But when I look at practice, very often there's a gap between what the companies and researchers are pushing and what's actually being used at the grassroots level. So my question is, why is this gap happening? To be very specific, how can we make sure that the technologies which intend to help the neurodivergent population actually do help them? Are there any strategies which we as in the tech sector or researchers, we can consciously follow to make that happen?
I'll go first, if that's okay, because I can't talk about technology specifically. But I think the point that I would make is that I don't do any work around mental health practices or interventions or policies without having and talking to people who it affects. And so I can only assume, as a neurotypical person, what is best. And I think the part that I would mention is that no technology, no approach will be effective unless you be curious and open to listening and then make the changes after you hear the feedback, unless you ask somebody. And I think what I'm realizing is when I work with my autistic youth partners and I walk into the room thinking I'm an expert in X, I slowly get brought down to reality where I actually don't know much because I haven't talked to these people who experience it themselves. So that would be the approach that I would say is nothing about them without them is sort of this neurodiversity inclusive movement that's really sweeping autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions.
Well, Carly took a lot of what I was going to say, but to add to what she said is that keep in mind that neurodiversity is a spectrum and every individual is going to be different. They'll have different strengths, different needs, different preferences, and therefore just ensure that your technology solutions can be customizable, can be individualized, because it kind of goes back to what Lloyd was saying earlier, that technology has a lot of potential. It's just limited by our own creativity, and technology can help people in different ways. For example, one neurodivergent person who has sensory issues, they might really, really, really like VR, but another person just absolutely hates it. No, this headset is weird. I don't want any part of this. So just keeping that in mind and just, again, like Carly said, just being open and listening to what they have to say and then kind of reaching out to that. And again, like Diwakar was talking about, also not necessarily about technology, but just try to work more broadly to align with what the research is showing is best practice and where the funding is going. Like in autism research in particular, a lot, and I do mean a lot of the funding goes into kind of the biological, genetic kind of causes of autism, if comparatively little of that going into, okay, so how do we can identify autism, but how do we actually support these autistic folks and ensure that they're having the best quality of life that they can have? And then also kind of my final point is that also building off what Lloyd said, also don't be afraid to make mistakes, because I can't speak as a neurotypical person, but I can speak that on my allyship journey for more broadly that just recognize that you're imperfect and that you have a lot to learn from the marginalized communities that you work with, and being willing to take risks and put yourself out there and trying to help and not get paralyzed by what if I make a mistake. There's a nice saying I like that goes that do the best you can until you learn better, then do better.
Fantastic answer. Thank you, Jennifer.
I love that response. So, yeah, I think the other thing is, as Jennifer kind of alluded to, I think is, people are still individuals too. Mm-hmm. And their thoughts, feelings, and emotions change constantly just like anybody else's. And I think when we think of the autistic spectrum and you're early on, you think of it as a straight line between 2 points. Later on, you realize, no, it's more of a 3D thing. And then eventually you realize it's like this cloud entity of how you think because everybody's different. And the other part of that is it's evolving, right? People change as they grow. And so somebody who says, yes, I love VR today might not like it tomorrow. And I think one thing we've talked about in the past was asking questions. And one thing I always tell my partners is trust the response. So I know some of my partners who, they rely a lot on reading faces to get intent. And it's like, no, if somebody says to you, this is how I learn, trust them. Don't try to read into it. Assume they're being honest, and if they aren't, then they'll tell you. And I think that's where that kind of corrective path comes in, where you try something. It's like, well, why? I'm just curious why you didn't enjoy this, and maybe it's a solvable problem. Because where they're thinking about isn't where you're thinking about. You might be thinking, my experience is terrible, and really the headset's uncomfortable or scratchy, or something that's going on there. And it's about trying to not make assumptions, asking lots of questions, and just trusting what they say is what they really think and feel, and ask questions to clarify, but don't second guess that for whatever purpose. But
Great, thank you all for the thoughtful responses. So I guess last question, and I know UofC has a number of initiatives to support neurodivergent students. And Jennifer and Carly, I think you are involved in a couple of them. Do you want to kind of briefly talk about them?
You talk first. Oh, okay. Great. So Jennifer and I'll let Jennifer speak about their experiences, but we have this great opportunity to be part of what's called the Work Integrated Learning Initiative here at the University of Calgary. So it's currently in year 2 of a 4-year initiative funded by the Seneve Family Foundation, who really saw an opportunity to help neurodivergent students thrive in work integrated learning and support this transition to employment. So we know that there's about 70,000 Canadians who are autistic, who are unemployed. And so what Seneve and folks at the Taylor Institute and part of this initiative have really tried to do is ensure that folks who are coming to university or post-secondary can then thrive and transition into the employment sector. And so there's really systems level work in partnership with students, campus will programs, and employers around the city, and community partners. It's one of a kind. I can truly say that because we did some research recently and looked to see how many Canadian institutions are providing autism-specific supports, and there are 6% of post-secondary institutions. So UCalgary is really a driver and a leader in this field. They're working with autistic people in partnership or neurodivergent folks, regardless of diagnosis or disclosure. We know that disclosure is a huge, significant barrier to accessing any kind of supports in post-secondary or elsewhere. And so they really allow for or encourage self-identification and non-disclosure. And what WILL encompasses is a variety of structured experiences where students learn by doing, which is key, in a workplace setting. And they really engage with employers to be able to provide supports around what it's like to be working or having a neurodivergent employee. What are the strengths that you can foster? What are the approaches you can try? And then they also connect with partners across campus to support neurodivergent students by teaching them kind of the same thing. What are effective strategies to engaging higher education students who are neurodivergent?
So I can only speak as an advisor to this program, not as someone who's actually gone through it. But I will say that I really enjoyed working with the WILL, I forget the Work Integrated Learning program here at UCalgary. Like, the people I've spoken to, they're extremely enthusiastic about the project, and an absolute honor to work with. And yeah, I feel like they really listen to what we neurodivergent students have to say and listening to our needs and concerns and trying to accommodate that. And yeah, that it's just Honestly, that at UCalgary, there's just been a huge paradigm shift lately in terms of neurodivergent supports. For example, on the fourth floor of Mac Hall, we have a sensory-friendly space, and we also have one in TFDL, the Taylor Family Digital Library, and those are just rooms that have dimmed lighting, some comfy beanbag chairs, and just a way to kind of escape from the sensory of chaos of UCalgary for a while. So yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done to fully integrate neurodiverse students into society in general, and UCalgary in particular, but I'm really happy with the steps that we're taking in the right direction, including this event that we have today.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing. We know that there's a huge increase in autistic people attending higher education, but only about 30% actually graduate. And so Jennifer and I are really working with a number of folks across campus here and across Canada to really try to improve those statistics and help people thrive into employment. And I think that starts with these kinds of initiatives that really work in partnership with neurodivergent folks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer and Kali. So we have more questions for you from the virtual audience. The first question is from Stina. As an early childhood educator, what can we do better to make sure young neurodivergent students are feeling supported, and what do we need to do better as a society to support those young people?
Do you want me to start? Is that
Go ahead.
Okay. So I get this question a lot because there's this idea that autistic people in early childhood are taught a lot about how to be perceived as neurotypical. So they engage in practices like social masking, where they mask what their authentic self is in order to fit in or to be perceived as neurotypical. And we know that that has detrimental impacts on the mental health of autistic people in terms of stress and burnout. And so as an early childhood educator for this person, what my recommendation would be is to encourage and empower autistic children to be themselves authentically and be able to meet their needs. So we know that what one support works for one child or individual or neurodivergent person does not work in the same way as the next person. So if you've met one person with autism, you've literally met one person with autism. And so we really need to think about how we can use different practices like universal design of learning, or UDL practices, to really meet the unique needs and foster strengths in folks who are neurodivergent. And so that would be my response. I don't know, Jennifer or Lloyd, what your thoughts are.
No, that's a great response, Carly. Just, again, kind of addressing the systematic level barriers, such as stigma for appearing different or doing things that are perceived as atypical by society. For example, stimming or kind of repetitive sensory movements, such as wringing your hands or twirling your hair or such. Those are really common in the autism spectrum. I think there's just a lot of work to be done to just kind of normalize those, that, oh, they're just stimming because they're excited or nervous. It's not something that we need to fix. So again, taking the focus away from fixing the individual so that they fit the neurotypical mold to fixing the neurotypical mold so that we can just accept people for who they are.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think, Kali, you're very popular today. Next question also for you.
Okay.
Could you share your thoughts regarding the increasing prevalence of ASD diagnosis in the US, especially in California, 1 in 22? Also, Jennifer, you are inspiring.
Jennifer is what? You're inspiring. This is a tough question for, what are we at, 8:30 this morning on a snowy day, but I'm happy to try to answer it. So it is true that the prevalence estimates are continuing to increase for autistic people and neurodivergent folks. There's a lot of theories, anywhere from what month you were born in to what environment you've been sort of living in. So there's not really a good understanding as to why that is happening. Some more concrete or, I guess, evidence-based reasons might be that we're just becoming better at identifying folks. And one of the areas that our team is particularly interested in is this growing need for our assessment tools and our diagnostic procedures to really be sort of gender diverse affirming. So recognizing that typically we know that autism occurs about 3 to 4 to 1, so 3 to 4 males per 1 female. And that's primarily because there's been this over-reliance on our measures and our criteria, for lack of a better word, that's really male-focused or oriented. It hasn't really considered folks who are non-male and how that autism might look in autistic people who are not assigned male at birth. And so I think that's one reason, is we're just becoming better at identifying it. And we also know that we're just, I think, becoming more open for folks to, there's less stigma potentially for people who are adults to be coming forward and saying, gosh, I think I might be autistic. And so there's those two reasons, I think, why there's an increase for sure, but still a lot more work. I will say that while we can be sort of really pondering about prevalence, and that's a great sort of reason to do the work we do, I really resonate with what Jennifer said around, we need to just support these folks. You know, it's increasing, yes, absolutely, but let's find a way to really ensure that these folks can thrive in our environment, in the neurotypical environment.
Thank you. There is actually a person with a mic here, so the audience, feel free to ask questions to any of our panelists here. Richard? Yeah.
Hello. Thanks for the panel. That's a very interesting discussion. You know, part of my research is to help students with ADHD, so that's very interesting to me. So my question for the panel is more on the technology side, I suppose. So a concern with any new technology is accessibility, right? So you can, you know, in terms of VR, you can build an awesome VR system, but if the target audience doesn't have access to a VR headset, then they won't be able to use the system, right? So I guess I want your views on this issue of accessibility. How would you address accessibility with the target audience, which is, you know, students with a neurodiverse background, and some of them are in underprivileged situations and they may not have access to the newest technology. Thank you.
Yeah, and for us as a business, there's a lot we have to do. So we're in the process of creating a association that helps talk more about individuals and try to bring accessibility to technology. That just becomes your company's goal, because if nobody buys VR headsets, then I'm probably not going to have a lot of work in about 2 months. And so that's an industry-wide problem. The more you get into different groups, the harder that gets. And we see that also in like palliative care and dementia care, where how are you going to ask them to spend $1,000 on technology when they're, you know, like it's just a real difficult barrier, because the technology can help, or it can change, or it can let them tell a story, or it can let them join a social classroom and then turn the classroom off at the click of a button. And it's like very obvious the benefits in some ways of all of this technology. Getting access to them is extremely difficult. And so as a company, we have to do certain things like support groups like Oculus, who have a lower cost headset that's very consumer focused. They're selling people's data, but they're driving the cost down to like $400 a headset. And when we started, it was about $5,000 to $7,000. And so these become almost like moral, ethical company decisions of like, I make a choice to support a company that does this because it benefits the community long term and gets access to these things. And your brain will just keep spinning on that all day. The short answer is that post-secondaries, events, meetup groups, all the things that probably somebody who's neurodiverse is going to feel differently about, and trying to get somebody to go to a meetup group that may not be comfortable, like it gets so complex. But what I do think is, and I personally believe, is that almost everything gets driven by post-secondary in a lot of ways. And so putting on an event where there's a VR day, we had one not too long ago at Platform Calgary, and anybody could just come and try a whole bunch of VR experiences, and there's no attachment to it, and you know, letting them kind of get exposed that way. But the accessibility in that regard becomes a financial barrier. And then there's the other accessibility challenge, which is VR. If you have serious visual impairment, it's unsolvable. You know, putting a VR headset on somebody who has issues seeing, we can't solve that problem. We can give them voiceovers and all of these things, but at that point they're just seeing color, and it's like, you know, the value changes significantly. And so you really need to define all of those accessibility challenges up front, get advice from smart people who can help you find ones that you're missing, and just come up with a plan to start knocking it down and creating groups and getting people access directly or indirectly to technology, I think is huge.
If I may jump in as well. And kind of another issue I was thinking about accessibility is just making sure that when you do develop the technology that neurodiverse people are actually going to be able to understand and use it. And I'm just thinking that sometimes in university communications and academics and stuff, they can be very, very verbose and hard to understand. So one simple thing you can do in your everyday lives to improve accessibility for neurodiverse people, and just everyone in general, is just be simple in your communication. Don't use complicated words when simpler ones would do. Just reduce your word count. Make sure you're being concise, and then that will save everyone time and also make sure your message comes across easier and is easier to just digest and understand. And then other things to just think about is, as Lloyd was alluding to, just different disabilities that intersect with neurodiversity. That, well, he kind of talked about visual impairment. Another thing to keep in mind is color blindness. That another simple thing you can do is just make sure that your designs or PowerPoint slides or what have you are accessible to colorblind people. A really simple thing you can do is just not make sure that if you're making a graph, for example, don't just make the colors red and green, because a lot of people do end up having that red and green color blindness where they just end up being the same color to them. So a different thing you could do is make sure that your red line is a solid color, whereas your green line has, for example, dashes. And in that way, there's an additional visual distinction between those lines. It doesn't just rely on color.
Thank you. We got a lot of questions coming in. The next question is from Diana. Thank you for bringing this important topic to the forefront. We need to chat about this. I had a negative response in reaching out to an organization I worked with to talk about leadership in relation to neurodivergent individuals. Any suggestions on how to broach this topic? We know that in our workforce, we have neurodivergent individuals, and in my opinion, need to understand better so we can give them a great employee experience. A difficult question, but...
Is the question more about how to foster like having conversations around neuroaffirming kind of practices? Yes. So one of the things that I would say is that just start. I think what Lloyd said about the paralysis around being too fearful of not doing it the right way is what really creates barriers. And so I think starting with something simple as understanding the environment in terms of sensory triggers or difficulties might be really a good place to start. Folks maybe realized or heard that, you know, having people clap at an event like this is actually really triggering, and so that's a great way you can just minimize things. There's small ways to be really neuroaffirming without putting much effort or resources into it. If there are resources, that's always a good thing, and really recommend that they go towards something around neuroaffirming practices. So there's various hubs and online resources. There's one out of the Australia that has actually co-created a number of resources for employers on how to learn about working with a neurodivergent person and what you could do and what are some of the practices that you could implement. And so happy for that maybe information to be sent out if I can send a link, if that's of interest to folks.
Thank you, Colleen. So one more question, I think it's more on the technology front. It's from Jet, who says, it sounds like most technology and education solutions are trial by fire, where neurodiverse students are just thrown into the environment before it is even deemed suitable. Does the panel have any advice, strategies, or solutions to determine environment suitability before student exposure?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't disagree, but I also think that there's a necessity to that, unfortunately, and it's because when you're building something nobody's ever seen before, you have to lead with courage. If you lead it with confidence, you're trying to build something. Confidence comes when you do the same thing over and over and over and over again. And depending on how your brain's structured, that may benefit you. But if you're stepping into something that's never been done before and you're taking a bunch of different people's doctors' ideas and thoughts and trying to pen it into a project of some kind, you got to be courageous. And that does mean trying something new. And I think this kind of goes back to what I said earlier, which is, it shouldn't be built without them. There should be somebody there on the team giving you advice and guidance and saying this is my suggestion. And I have a practical example of, I was working with a group recently on a neurodivergent project telling their story. And we had a group of maybe 8 or 9 neurodivergent individuals, and it was fantastic. I felt like I was at home on a team. I felt perfectly comfortable, and it was great. But then a business and some other people came in the middle, and it separated us from having access and all of this stuff, and then the project just kind of fell right to the floor, and then the experience got sent to a writer who's not really, telling the right story, and then it gets back to the group, and they're just not happy at the end. And so I think it's good to have it brief and to the point. And the other challenge too, and because they're saying, in education, it gets kind of shown too early without it being far enough along. And I think that's also because in education, people are learning at an education facility how to create VR for the first time too. So you haven't learned all the rules yet of what makes a good VR experience, let alone how am I going to make this a safe space. But in order to get somewhere, when there's no funding and there's no ability and no access, you have to be courageous and rely on students to come up with ideas. And I think, the best thing you can do to overcome that is many conversations early on, getting people reviewing things. And something we do at our work is we try to tell everybody to treat their work as their legacy. And so if you're creating a project for telling somebody's story, you should be so proud of that project, and everything you do for that month should be about creating this beautiful story, and it should mean a lot to you. And if it doesn't, then there's a real problem. And I think as long as it's brought in that perspective where you're doing your absolute best work, you're bringing in the best advisors you can, you're building something to that, I think if you miss the mark, it's not from a lack of trying at that point. So,
thank you. I think the overarching theme I'm seeing is nothing about them without them. So as long as we have them on board as equal collaborators and partners, I don't think we should be scared into trying any new technology. And I can speak to that as well, because when I started my research 2-3 years ago about using AR headsets on some of the most sensorily sensitive parts of the autism spectrum, we got a lot of pushback saying that, they're not going to be able to tolerate that, this is cruel and unusual punishment. But what we did was we actually engaged with the families. We engaged with the autistic folks and said, what can we do to make this experience pleasant? Do you want to try wearing a baseball hat for 5 minutes? Can you keep it on?
Yeah.
Can you keep it on for 2 more minutes? Can you practice wearing a ski goggle, right? So I think it's something to be cognizant about, but not to the point of being paralyzed and not doing anything and denying these folks the next generation of experiences and technology, right? I mean, they crave AR experiences and VR experiences too. You just have to make it right for them.
Yeah.
Can I make one just last? I forgot to mention when we were talking about the will, and I see Greta here, so I wanted to make sure. If people are interested in learning more about the Will Initiative, there is an open house happening at 10 a.m. this morning at the Taylor Institute. So, sorry? The Design Lab. Basement of McEwen Center, Student Center, just for folks to know. Sorry, I didn't mention that earlier.
Fantastic. So we have actually time for one quick question from the audience before we wrap up. Yeah? So can you?
Hi, thanks for this. This has been great. My name is Curtis Slater. I'm the executive director of the PrEP Society. We do services for children and teens with Down syndrome in Calgary. And so this is a very relevant topic to us. And as part of our organization, at the core of what we do is inclusion. We want to make sure that our kids are active and included in their communities and have those opportunities. So I'm curious, just from your own work or in work that you've seen, can you give some, what are some of the best examples that you've seen of technology being used to break down those barriers of inclusion and really allow for those inclusive spaces for neurodivergent individuals?
Yeah,
Go ahead. Yeah.
I can weigh in on this one. I will say quickly, I realized about 2 questions ago, we had a question about how do I get my team on board? And I just wanted to kind of go back to that for one quick moment and say, because they were like, I proposed this to my team and they weren't receptive. Really quickly on there, I just want to say one of the challenges we have in society that doesn't get discussed is that your ability to socialize is almost more important than almost anything you can do. And that's a big part of the problem, because your ability to sell the team to do something, the ability to convince people, like it's hugely reliant on your ability to speak. There are tools that can help with that. I recommend looking into change management process, which teaches you how to get what's in it for me so that they get on board. My brain's stuck there and I just had to unstick it. On the technology side, it's fascinating. And what I will say is all of it is we're at like the 2% of the 100% journey. Like, it's all very experimental. And some of the best stuff I've seen, I'm actually questioning the value of and started questioning it last night. One was a company I worked with a long time ago that got us into looking into autism the very first time, was a blue-collar, very interesting gentleman who was transporting a lot of autistic children to and from school. And the goal is, how do I make sure that they're comfortable and happy when they get there? Because if they have an episode, their whole day is going to be shot. And the mom was upset because she couldn't make eye contact with the child. The child, though, could watch cartoons and actually mouth the words to the cartoon. And so the idea was, well, we could put mixed reality as a layer between there, so when the child looks at mom, they see a cartoon and they can make eye contact. Absolutely fantastic. The reason I question that now, though, is we're doing that for mom. We're not doing that for, like we're solving the problem backwards. And so it's just fascinating. The more you learn, the more you unlearn. And I think it was kind of mentioned before that you learn, you do your best, and then do better. And something else that we've been talking about is we do a lot of social spaces for education, and the idea of building some tooling for autistic or neurodiverse individuals to be able to join a classroom, but then they can disconnect at any time. Because I don't know what somebody goes through, but if I was, really struggling and suddenly I'm in the middle of a classroom surrounded by all these people and they're all staring at me and I'm, like all of those things, to have an emergency button that you can just flick off in your home, in your bedroom. And I think that's where the power comes in of, I don't want to say letting somebody control what's going on around them. It's more like giving them the power to control their environment. And that's kind of how I see it. But
Great, fantastic. Thanks to the panel again for the really insightful and thought-provoking discussions. I think you have given us all a lot of food for thought. So I know we cannot clap to be neuro-affirming. We will have a neuro-affirming applause.
yes.
And with that, I'll hand it over to Anders.
Well, thank you so much, Diwakar, and thank you so much, Jennifer, Carly, and Lloyd as well for the great discussion and providing your insights and expertise this morning. It is fascinating how quickly an hour goes by when you have a topic this engaging. I also want to say thanks to everyone here in attendance, both in person and online, for spending part of your morning with us. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves, and I hope that you'll join us for our next edition of Schulich Connects, which will be on April 25th. The topic then will be expanding perspectives on engineering. So keep an eye on the email inbox for those invites.
Thanks for tuning in to this Schulich Connects, proudly sponsored by TD Insurance. We'll see you next time.